On the international front, Prime Minister Lawrence Wong says relations between U.S. and China are in a more challenging place following Donald Trump's victory in this week's presidential election. Well, it remains to be seen where tensions between the two world superpowers are headed. Mr. Wong says Singapore will continue to uphold the value of multilateralism and build strong strategic partnerships around the globe. Now, he says that's how the country can survive and thrive in this new volatile world. Richard Matthew reports.
Two hot wars in Europe and the Middle East. Along with that, a second Trump presidency, which could further strain US-China relations. And it's in this volatile world that Singapore's Prime Minister Lawrence Wong says things could easily go wrong.
All in all, it means a less hospitable environment, especially for small countries like Singapore. And that's why we have to work even harder to strengthen our network of friends and partners and to work with like-minded countries to shape international norms and rules and to find common ground on issues of shared concern.
That's why PM says he's been on what he describes as a full schedule of overseas work trips. He calls it his key duty as a Prime Minister, as sound foreign policies and multilateralism are key for Singapore to survive and thrive. But he'll wait and see with Mr. Trump back in the White House on how the US will approach its dealings with China and multilateralism.
I think it remains to be seen because we've heard what Mr. Trump hopes to do in his campaign, but what he actually does, I think we'll have to see, including what happens with the key members of his administration and the key members of his cabinet. But I would say, taking a step back, setting aside whether the issue of who is in power in the administration, the broad dynamics in the US-China relationship is one where we are very concerned about.
While the US president-elect is no stranger to work with, he hopes Mr. Trump's administration will be more involved in Southeast Asia, especially in terms of trade and security. He points out that Singapore and the US share a free trade agreement that is recognized to be the gold standard.
We would like to see more American economic engagement in Southeast Asia. Up to now, America remains the largest source of foreign direct investments in Southeast Asia, even more than China. But American trade lags behind China. And I think there's still a lot more that the US MNCs can do and would be happy to do in Southeast Asia in both trade and investments. We want to facilitate that because we think it's good for the region.
To keep trade barriers low, PM Wong says Singapore will be an advocate for stronger multilateral institutions and do more to promote trade around Asean and other regional forums.
And I'm now joined by Associate Professor John Donaldson from the School of Social Sciences at the Singapore Management University. Professor Donaldson, welcome to the studio.
Thank you so much.
PM Wong talking about concerns over rising frictions between the US and China and how both sides will have to make decisions on how they would engage each other. What can Singapore do to facilitate this relationship without having to choose a side?
Well, the miracle of what Singapore has been doing for so many years is that even as it's brokered the US and China relations without picking one side, it actually convinced the American side that Singapore was on our side. And that's without angering China. And that is a miracle that's going to be harder and harder for Singapore's leaders to pull off. I think all that Singapore can do, as PM Wong said, is react to decisions that are being made on both sides and try to play any kind of a brokering role. That said, Singapore has done very effectively. For instance, the North Korea-US summit or the Cross-Strait summit being, held in Singapore, and Singapore really shown as kind of playing this almost a Switzerland role like in the region as a mediator. That's right.
And PM Wong reiterated several times during his press conference how multilateralism is weakening and how multilateral institutions need to be refreshed where necessary. Could President-elect Trump's rejection to international institutions put more pressure on trade organizations to change for the worse?
For sure. I mean, Trump in his first presidency basically ignored the World Trade Organization ever since, China entered the World Trade Organization in 2001. What would be normal is if you had a trade dispute is to bring it there. But he completely ignored those institutions and those agreements. Trump 2.0, when he's much more powerful and he's going to put in more like-minded people, I can only imagine this is going to be worse. And for countries like Singapore that depend upon the free trade architecture that has been the basis of the global economy for so long, I can understand why PM Wong is worried about it. And all I think folks like, countries like Singapore can do is to do whatever they can to shore up these institutions, given that neither of the great powers in the world are supportive of them anymore.
And one of those regional institutions is ASEAN. And ASEAN's priority has always been on centrality and neutrality. How do you see the bloc reacting to US and China tensions? Do you see a possibility in building a shared consensus, or do you see players, pulled in various directions?
I think it could go either way. I think part of the hope of ASEAN is that ASEAN countries have been cooperating for a very long time, but it's always been a loose configuration of countries. Can events bring that bloc closer together? Folks like President Obama in its pivot back to Asia was trying to reassure Southeast Asian nations and American allies of American presence, but that is not happening, at least not for the next 4 years. It's going to be very difficult for America to play the same role. But then ASEAN has always faced forces that divide it. You have countries that are seen to be leaning on China's side, countries that are seen to be leaning on America's side, and the danger is that those tensions will continue to drive ASEAN apart, and the common ground that ASEAN has may get narrower and narrower.
And, what would be some areas that you think Singapore could take the lead in when it comes to strengthening and revamping multilateral institutions? What would be perhaps some new areas of cooperation?
I think it's going to be really quite difficult. The truth is, I think the stability of the world has depended upon multilateral action, especially for crises like the environment, terrorism, migration flows, other issues that are very difficult, impossible to manage as sovereign states. You have to have a multilateral, institutions. It's going to be difficult for countries like Singapore to continue that along issues that really require world management until great powers realize again that we need this kind of a cooperation in order to manage these common threats.
PM Wong earlier said that Singapore will continue to advocate for multilateralism. Can we actually make a difference against rising global populism?
I do see some hope. That every wave of populism, there comes a counter wave. That there are many allies that Singapore can turn to. There's countries in Europe, other places. It's just that it's a major problem that neither the two great powers are going to be especially interested in it. But don't forget, U.S. is still very pluralistic. There are Democrats and Republicans who all believe in multilateralism. And I think, for instance, in Track 2 talks, there's ways to maintain ties with the supporters of multilateralism. And American history has shown that when America becomes isolationist, that the reaction in the world becomes a big problem. And then America turns back to multilateralism. And so I think Singapore can continue to keep that hope alive, and that when America comes back to its commitment to multilateralism that has benefited us all, that Singapore will be part of that, will be an important reason why there's a multilateralism to come back to.
With Mr. Trump's second term in office, do you envision geopolitical environments destabilizing in the middle to long term, and how would Singapore need to reconsider the way we conduct our external affairs?
I think Singapore has to continue to do what it's been doing, which is, a very professionalized, a diplomatic corps that is trying to not only assert its own interests, of course, but also to try to keep, important issues that it, work with other countries to the extent that it can. But I do think it's going to be very difficult in this, in this kind of an environment. And I think, PM Wong made that very clear to the Singaporean people. PM Wong is almost unique among world leaders in that he has to deal with very, very local issues like MRT, the sewer system, everything, and has to deal with these high politics, political issues at the same time. He has to deal with domestic and international, in order to be seen as an effective leader. And now the international environment has become that much more complicated for, the PAP, the governing party.
Has got a very tough job ahead of him. Thank you so much, Professor Donaldson. Appreciate your insights as always. That was Associate Professor John Donaldson from the School of Social Sciences at the Singapore Management University.